Okay, good morning, everyone. As I said, some concern, some of you may be struggling to hear us. If you could let us know of any problems in the chat bar, that would be very good. Firstly, thank you all for joining. This is the second webinar that we're holding on the call for input. Today, we're looking to summarise our staging proposals within the call for input. Again, we make clear that these are our recommendations. In due course, DWP will be considering the model and associated legislation associated with staging, but these are the programme's recommendations. We'll provide some background and the principles underpinning the approach. We'll go through the staging recommendations and summarise the approach that we are recommending may be adopted. We are also assuming that those of you joining the call have had the opportunity to read the call for input documents. We're assuming a level of understanding with some of the associated detail. We're then keen to allow plenty of time for questions and answers. We will seek to answer those questions as many as we can, but we anticipate that we may need to answer some following the webinar, and we'll make sure all the questions raised are subsequently published. I should also add we are looking to record the webinar, and that will also be published. But I suggest we move on, and I'll hand over to David to go through the recommendations.
Thanks very much, Paul. Good morning, everyone. So as Paul said, this webinar obviously is to focus on the recommendations that we put in the staging call for input. And this webinar follows one we held yesterday, which was focused on the pensions dashboards ecosystem and what that will mean in practice for pension providers. So hopefully everyone, or at least most of you, might have been able to join us yesterday. If you weren't, the webinar was recorded and the recording will be available on our website in due course. So I'd encourage you to watch it when you can. And as Paul said, as well as the call for input document that we obviously published the other week, hopefully you might also have had a chance to have reviewed our new information on the ecosystem and how it will work, which we published on a new data providers hub on the PDP website recently at the same point, I think on 26th of May last month. If you've not yet had a chance to look at that, I'd encourage you to do so. The call for input and the recommendations for staging should really be read alongside that new information for data providers. And also, I'd actually just like to highlight also our publication at the end of last year on data standards. So these publications together form a kind of trilogy in a sense, admittedly not one exactly to rival Tolkien, but there is a sort of package, the three together, with the staging call for input standing on the shoulders to some extent on the other two. So just to outline those, the data standards publication published back in December set out the data items that providers will need to use to be able to match people to pensions and to be able to return pensions information to members at their dashboards. So that sets out what data providers will have to receive and return. The second part is the new detailed information on our website about how the ecosystem will work and what that will therefore require of data providers. And this was the subject of yesterday's webinar. And so this provides information on how providers will need to receive and return the data. And then thirdly, the call for input, which is a subject of today's webinar in particular, with the staging recommendations, addresses the question of when. So these three together really kind of provide the what, the how, and the when. So in considering our recommendations for the when, we'd really encourage respondents to also look at the other two and the information we provided on the questions of what and how. So as Paul said, I'm just going to provide an overview of the staging recommendations that we set out in the call for input, after which we have a panel to take questions to help clarify things and provide further explanation, if that would be helpful. And the purpose of that is to help you to respond to the call for input. I just want to flag that the call for input is open for responses until the 9th of July. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. And again, please. Thank you. Sorry, one further, no, it just took a while to upload there, thank you. Okay, so to provide a little bit of background before we get into the recommendations, and then we'll take you through the actual recommendations for the kind of how the staging profile might look. So we've been working with our colleagues at the regulators to look at how you could segment the pensions universe for staging. So using TPR and FCA data, as well as wider evidence, including actually responses to the call for input on data that we published last summer. We've developed some recommendations for staging, which we're now sharing in the form of the call for input to gather industry and consumer groups' feedback. It's worth highlighting again, just as Paul said at the beginning, that these are PDP proposals. They don't represent government policy, and ultimately the decision is for DWP and FCA, who are keen to hear from you as well. And DWP are joining our panel for the Q&A at the end too. But the purpose of us sharing these proposals is for industry feedback, to gather that feedback and enable that feedback to help inform government's thinking ahead of a DWP consultation on draft regs for occupational schemes anticipated at the end of the year, and then subsequently a corresponding FCA consultation on draft rules for personal pension providers. Now, the slide gives an overview of the policy objectives. I won't go through these now, but just suffice to say, really, these have obviously informed our approach to the staging recommendations. If we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just a little bit about kind of context of what we mean by staging. When we refer to staging, we're referring to the process by which pension schemes and providers, and we're using providers as a shorthand. So staging refers to the process by which providers will be onboarded to the pensions dashboards ecosystem. And to make dashboards happen, government regulations and FCA rules will require pension providers to make savers data available to them via dashboards. And this will include, in scope, all UK pensions, including state pension, defined benefit contributions, defined benefit pensions and defined contribution pensions. And out of scope are, at least for initial dashboards, are non-UK pensions and pensions that are currently paying out. So the regulations and rules will set out the latest date by which providers will have to connect and will specify what they have to do to comply. But in short, when it's staged, a provider must have complied with the requirement to connect, which means taking a series of steps beforehand to be ready to connect, and must be ready to search members' data when they receive a request from a user at their dashboard, to match individuals to their pensions, and to be able to return pensions information to members via their dashboards. It's also just worth, I think, highlighting that when a provider is staged, that's not necessarily the same thing as being able for members to be able to actually view their data via dashboards at that point. So a critical mass of pensions that are findable via dashboards will be necessary before dashboards can be launched to the public. And this obviously enables scale testing of the end-to-end service before public launch. So it's important just to separate those two things, staging from the data being necessarily available to members at that point. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the problem statement is there are several thousand pension providers in scope, and there's significant diversity in terms of the size, the benefit structures, and their general readiness to comply with the requirements for dashboards. So as a result, staging is a bit of a balancing act, really. So on one hand, it has to achieve the widest possible coverage. In other words, the maximum number of pensions that are findable and viewable via dashboards as soon as possible. And that will be important to establish credibility with consumers. But on the other hand, it also has to be deliverable. So it has to take into account the practical constraints and circumstances within industry, and to ensure there's a reasonable expectation of providers being compliant. And also needs to take into account regulators' capacity to manage the increased regulatory demands, and also the capacity of the central digital architecture to manage the number of connections. And in addition to these two driving principles, really, of pace of coverage and deliverability, we also considered other factors such as how to minimise competition impacts in the staging profile, how to ensure opportunities are built in to test, learn and improve as we go through the profile, and also potential impacts of the staging model in terms of consumers who may derive the greatest value from being reconnected with pensions, and also any impacts of the staging profile on consumers with protected characteristics. If we move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So guided by these principles, we've worked with the regulators to look at the available evidence on different possible cohorts of providers and come up with some proposals for the staging profile. But we're seeking further evidence, and hence this is the whole point of the call for input. And the call for input presents a valuable opportunity for stakeholders to feed in evidence and insights early to help inform policy development. If we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you, and one further actually. So what do we recommend? We're proposing that staging takes place over 3 waves, with occupational schemes with 1,000+ members and FCA regulated providers of personal pensions in the first wave. This would then be followed by a subsequent wave of occupational schemes with between 100 and 999 members after the bulk of wave 1 schemes have onboarded. And then finally in wave 3, the smallest schemes with under 100 members would follow, with the timing for wave 3 to be determined in line with the formation of the integrated service provider or ISP market, which will be vital to staging these schemes. And the rationale for this is quite straightforward. If we flick onto the next slide, please. This explains the rationale for this 3-wave approach, which is essentially that the concentration in the marketplace means that you can cover the vast majority of pension entitlements within the scope of dashboards by only staging a quite small proportion of paid pension providers. So as you can see on the graph shows the cumulative proportion of memberships and of schemes that's represented by each of the scheme size bandings. And as you can see, if you move from left to right along the x-axis, moving from largest schemes to the smallest scheme bandings, a tiny proportion of schemes accounts for a huge proportion of memberships. So by the time you get to schemes with 1,000+ members, you're still at only 5% of all the schemes that need to be connected, yet you reach 99% of memberships. So we think that's quite compelling for this 3-wave approach and prioritizing. If we go on to the next slide, please. Go into a little bit more detail about the waves. So wave 1, kind of just to explain who we think should be in wave 1 and why. So first of all, prioritizing this first wave, we think delivers in terms of the pace of coverage. As I said, it meets 99% of coverage within wave 1. And in terms of deliverability, the evidence we looked at indicated that deliverability for wave 1 providers would be higher than for the subsequent waves in terms of things like, for example, administration standards, levels of technological sophistication with digitized records and online offerings, and also staging wave 1 first ahead of the waves 2 and 3 will also help enable the regulators to build capacity and allow more time for the ISP market to develop, which will be critical to onboarding smaller schemes. So our recommendation, based on indications of industry readiness and the expected time required, is that wave 1 providers should all be staged within up to 2 years from April 2023. But there's quite a bit of diversity within wave 1, so we're not recommending an open sort of window of up to 2 years. We're recommending sequential cohorts within wave 1. And if we go on to the next slide, we can go into a bit more detail of these cohorts for wave 1. Thank you. So as you can see on the slide, there are 3 recommended cohorts for the first wave. The first one being master trusts and FCA regulated providers of personal pensions. And the reasons for this, first of all, in terms of the pace of coverage argument, this cohort alone accounts for over 2/3 of all of the pension entitlements within the scope of dashboards. So master trusts account for 19 million entitlements, personal pensions account for 28 million. So there's a really strong argument in terms of pace there. It also follows the DWP principle of DC first in recognition of the increasing shift towards defined contribution pensions in the UK pensions landscape. And there's also important for auto-enrolment. So master trusts and personal pensions also dominate the auto-enrolment space. So getting these providers on board first covers a large proportion of the current workplace market, or DC market anyway. So just under 62% of eligible job holders have been enrolled into a master trust and a further 29% into a personal pension. And secondly, in terms of deliverability, the evidence that we reviewed indicated that master trusts and personal pension providers would have the least deliverability challenges of the providers in scope. So this, for example, there's some evidence here that master trusts and personal pension providers are obviously subject to existing disclosure requirements, and which makes them better placed to be able to comply. There are similarly existing supervisory frameworks for both, and also master trusts are more likely to offer online access. They're more technologically sophisticated and therefore probably better placed to meet the technical demands of the pensions dashboards ecosystem. And there's also evidence of a better record keeping and better quality administration and governance. 2 caveats, though, we should just mention for this first cohort. The first is that we recognise that not all master trusts are the same. So some are not competing commercially in the auto-enrolment space in the same way. And some of these non-commercial master trusts are quite small, so there's much more limited argument for their inclusion in the first cohort, and they could be less well placed to do so. So we're proposing that master trusts with below 20,000 members could go into the second cohort. And second caveat is that for providers of personal pensions, we recognise there's quite a range here, and some providers have much greater complexity than others and will face more challenges getting dashboard ready. So for example, where they operate multiple systems and have older products, there might be extra challenges there. So our suggestion here is that they could all connect in the first cohort, but if there's evidence that certain elements might need longer, they could be given some flexibility potentially for connecting legacy books, but still within the first wave, we think. It's also worth just flagging here that the state pension information is expected to be available alongside the first staging cohort. Coming on to cohort 2 then, the second cohort we're suggesting should be DC schemes that are used for automatic enrolment. And the argument again in terms of pace, first of all, is that cumulatively after cohort 1, this takes us to 98% of all DC pensions, which is important for achieving a critical mass of DC pensions. This cohort is also particularly important for underpensioned groups, women, ethnic minorities, disabled savers, who are more likely to have DC pensions than DB pensions. In terms of deliverability, we looked at evidence that indicated these schemes are likely to be better placed than those we've placed in subsequent cohorts to stage. So as with some indications of this, as with master trusts and personal pension providers, there are existing disclosure requirements that mean they're probably better placed. They're also more likely than other DC schemes and DB schemes to offer online access to meet governance requirements and have better administration. So the deliverability is higher than for subsequent schemes as well. And we're suggesting this cohort would then include any remaining master trusts with memberships under 20,000 that weren't covered in the first cohort. And we're suggesting that this cohort would also include any hybrid schemes operating both DC and DB sections, where that DC element is used for automatic enrolment. And then coming on to cohort 3, still within wave 1, but the third cohort, this would then be all remaining occupational schemes, so both legacy DC schemes and DB trust-based schemes and public service schemes with 1,000+ members, ordered largest to smallest. And the argument here for this cohort is that in terms of pace, there's a comprehensive coverage of DC pensions might be achieved by master trusts and the DC schemes used for automatic enrolment. But for full coverage, that requires all occupational schemes, and in particular large DB schemes. This cohort alone accounts for over a quarter of all the pension entitlements in scope of dashboards, and this will then deliver the 99% coverage by the end of wave 1. It's also important for those closer to retirement, so onboarding public service schemes and the largest DB schemes will also be important for older savers. And then if we turn to the deliverability evidence that we've reviewed, the evidence indicated greater deliverability challenges for this cohort. So these then master trusts and personal pension schemes and the DC schemes used for automatic enrolment. So these cohort 3 schemes are older and have more data quality challenges. Both legacy DC and DB schemes tend to be less digitally sophisticated and less likely to offer online access and might be less technologically ready. DB schemes also don't have the requirements to issue annual benefit statements, so might be less well placed. There's also the GMP equalisation challenges for DB schemes, and in addition to that, there are the challenges from the cloud judgment for public service schemes, and we've actually included some specific questions on this in the call for input to build evidence on what that means in practice for schemes readiness to connect. So we think all of that indicates this cohort might need longer than the 2 preceding cohorts to be able to stage. But reflecting the importance of large DB schemes in terms of that critical mass, and in particular the large DB schemes and public service schemes, we recommend the largest be staged from autumn 2023 and that all would be staged within wave 1, so up to 2 years from April 2023. And similarly, reflecting the importance of public sector schemes, notwithstanding the McLeod judgment challenges that I mentioned on top of GMP equalisation, these schemes represent about 1/5 of membership, so it's important to include them within wave 1 as well, we think. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So expanding on the waves 2 and 3 now. So the second wave we're proposing would be the schemes with between 100 and 999 members, ordered by size to be connected after the bulk of wave 1 schemes are already on board. The argument here in terms of pace is that the case for medium schemes in terms of pace of coverage is actually much more limited. So although they represent a large number of schemes, there's over 2,400 schemes here, and that accounts for about 7% of all the schemes that will need to be connected. They actually only represent less than 1% of all the entitlements in scope for dashboards. So there's less of a sort of convincing argument for including them early in terms of pace. Their inclusion may, however, be important for savers that are approaching retirement, as their membership is primarily deferred. But in moving to the kind of considerations in terms of deliverability, we didn't see any conclusive evidence to indicate that they will struggle to comply more than Wave 1, but there is evidence that they're less likely to offer online access, so it may indicate lower levels of technological sophistication and more challenges there. And there's definitely evidence of a higher per member cost impact. And this is also a significant increase in volume of schemes for the regulator to deal with. So this is nearly double the number of schemes in Wave 2 compared to Wave 1. So staging these schemes after the first wave will allow the regulator to apply learning to ramp up its functions and allow more time for the ISP market to develop, which should also in turn help to reduce the cost impacts for schemes. And then for Wave 3, the final wave of small and micro schemes, and here we're talking about those with under 100 members, we're suggesting they would form a third staging wave. And the rationale for this is, first of all, in terms of pace, there's very little gain in terms of coverage from this wave. So this third wave represents less than 0.2% of all of the entitlements in scope of dashboards. But in terms of deliverability, the operational challenges are quite significant. So there are almost 29,000 small and micro schemes to onboard, so a 500% increase in volume of entities to regulate compliance for. And there are quite well-established concerns around governance and data quality and their readiness to participate. There's also quite a large number here of third-party administrators, which are less likely to be technologically sophisticated. So the ISP market, we think, is going to be quite crucial to enabling small and micro schemes to be able to comply with dashboards requirements. So deferring these schemes to the third wave provides some time for the ISP market to develop and time for the regulators to evolve guidance, education and compliance functions, which is essentially taking a similar approach to the approach that was taken with automatic enrolment, which proved successful there. And in the call for input, we've included some questions where we're seeking evidence and insight to inform the timing for Wave 3. So these are the proposals, our proposals for staging. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Finally, I just wanted to acknowledge and address the proposal that some respondents to our previous call for input that I mentioned earlier on data last summer put forward, that pensions dashboards could initially be limited to finding pensions and an extension to include return of value information at a later date. So we have considered this, but the available evidence indicates that not including values would probably lack credibility with consumers. So instead, what we've done is we've based our recommendations on the requirements being on the assumption that requirements of providers would be both to find pensions and to return values information. And instead, what we've done is sought to address provider concerns about readiness through the staging profile itself. So those who are less ready to return data would have more time to do so. It's also just worth highlighting, I think, that our recommendations concern the minimum that would be required by law, but we actively encourage earlier participation by providers, especially the largest providers, in advance of their staging date, so bringing forwards, having early staging if possible. And this will be important to deliver a critical mass of pensions that are findable sooner. It'll also be good for pension providers, and we know from our engagement with industry so far that there's definitely appetite for this. This obviously gives providers more control over their individual delivery timeline, and it will also essentially enable more efficient onboarding by enabling ISPs or administrators to connect multiple clients at one time in bulk, which should hopefully reduce the costs for schemes. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, and actually one further. So I hope that's a helpful overview of the proposals in the call for input. The final slide here just gives a summary of the 3 waves and the cumulative proportion of memberships that would be covered. And I'll just, whilst that's up and having a look at that, I'd just like to end by reiterating the point that the whole intention of the call for input is to gather stakeholders' evidence and insights and to be able to enable to feed them into the DWP's and FCA's policy development. So we'd really encourage you all to respond to the call for input by the 9th of July, which is when it closes. As well as seeking evidence and insights in relation to our recommendations, the call for input also poses some questions, invites providers to indicate if they plan to stage early, and there are some questions about how they plan to connect as well to help inform our planning for onboarding. There are also some specific questions about software providers' intentions regarding the ISP offerings, again, to help us to kind of plan to engage industry and plan accordingly. So please do have a look through all of the questions and please do respond. But now I think you have the opportunity to put questions to the panel. This is your chance to ask any questions that might help you to respond to the call for input. So I think I'm going to hand back to Paul at this point.
Sorry, unmute. Thanks, Dave. Hopefully that's given everyone, I'm sure that's given everyone a very good summary of the recommendations. We've had a number of questions so far, so please keep posting. One from Terry Rudge, who represents a large TPA. For some reference, a third of our schemes fall under small micro, yet it covers 0.5% of membership. Should they be looking stage post 2025? The proportion is really going to shrink. I mean, we know there's particular challenges for smaller schemes. The level of automation may differ, but we also think there's opportunities to, as Dave just said, to utilise sort of integrated service provider middleware solutions to onboard in bulk. So we're actively encouraging that where TPAs are able to onboard smaller arrangements, then we'd strongly encourage them to do so. Yet we acknowledge the challenges that can be inherent under those smaller arrangements. It also helps in terms of finding lost pensions. We're likely to see lost pensions concentrated perhaps in those smaller schemes. So we see that as a real benefit and is an argument for including those smaller arrangements as soon as possible. But we're keen to understand more in relation to that cohort. So please feedback the challenges and your thinking around that rationale. That's an area that we're very keen to get a better understanding of. There's a question on any work been done to test the quality of data, endorsing your contention that certain types of pensions have cleaner data. We know providers have done a lot of work on this, and through our engagement with industry over the earlier part of this year, that helped for us to build a better understanding of the data challenges that exist. I think there's a view there that the older the data, the more problematic it may be. We know that some of the older data does have issues, and we know that some of the decisions taken way back in time may influence the challenges that exist in relation to the dashboard. So we know that some providers have books of business that date back many years, and the decision taken at the time may not have incorporated holding all of the data required for the dashboard. So we know that there is some challenges around particular books of business. We also know, and this point has been made by almost universally by every provider we've talked to, that the presence of data is not necessarily a guarantee of it being accurate. So we know that there are challenges within data, and there is likely to be more challenges relating to older data. And in terms of when that was first input onto systems, that was likely to have been via manual input, and therefore the chance of errors, data input errors being made at the time are likely to be higher then than potentially they would be now. So I think there is likely to be a correlation with the age of data. But what we've heard is that the presence of fine data in particular is generally there, with the exception of addresses. But clearly that's something that we are also keen to improve our understanding on. So any further information you can provide would be gratefully received. What is the likely dashboard availability point? I mean, that's something that will be considered further, but the research we've carried out shows that users, it's very important that users have a high level of confidence that when they use the dashboard, they are likely to find their entitlements, because the trust and confidence in the dashboard is likely to erode if we don't have a critical mass of data on there. We believe with the stage and recommendations we've proposed, we are likely to hit, I think going back to Dave's slide, you'll see that using the recommendations, we achieve a very high level of critical mass early within the staging profile. So we're confident that we can achieve that critical mass within a reasonable time frame to move from, move to public beta and allow users to begin using the dashboard. And pace is one of the key principles that underpin the approach and the basis of the recommendations contained within the call for input.
Yeah, just to add to that, actually, Paul, I was just going to add that I think you've explained the kind of rationale for the thinking about dashboards available point and achieving that critical mass, which, as you said, is research indicates is going to be important because of that low tolerance that consumers will have for an incomplete dashboard. I'm just going to add that exactly when the dashboard's available point might fall, it's hard to tell because it will depend on a number of things. So first of all, that will depend on what the actual staging delivery timeline is. Obviously, we set out recommendations for cohorts, but we've also posed some questions of industry to kind of ascertain when exactly different providers might be able to be expected to be able to comply. So when the dashboard's available point will depend on how soon providers, particularly the largest providers, and particularly the largest DB schemes and public service schemes, can be staged. So that's why we've included some questions on that. It will also depend on early staging. So regardless of what the final staging profile is as set out in rules and regulations, the dashboard's available point will be also in part determined by volumes of providers that are able to stage early. As a result of their ISP or administrator being able to connect multiple clients all at once in bulk and connecting them into a single ecosystem through a single endpoint. And then also there's perhaps also a judgment call for the government about, informed hopefully by our research, but also about how much coverage is sufficient to constitute a critical mass. So exactly when that point will fall is hard to say, but as Paul says, our recommendations deliver the 99% of coverage, which I think by any reasonable definition is certainly a critical mass within the first wave. And we think it should be, as Paul highlighted, given the focus on pace, we think it should be as early as is feasible within that first wave.
Thanks, Dave. James, there's a question: when will detailed technical specifications as to how to onboard be available, as that will heavily influence when schemes will understand development requirements? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there are a number of pieces of information that will come out. Obviously, on yesterday's webinar for the core architecture, we did run through what providers could be doing now in order to prepare in terms of ensuring data quality, preparing to have endpoints available for both the test and live systems, ensuring they notify their technology team or their software provider that this is coming up. There are a number of other things that are ongoing. So very soon in mid-July, we are looking at discussing the API standards with providers, and we'll be seeking input on that. And then in terms of the early alpha participants, we'll be working with them from January to around May of 2022. Once obviously we've been through that alpha process, we should have very detailed requirements in terms of what's required for onboarding. However, we are working on those from now, and we will release what we can as soon as possible. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, James. Another question: will schemes be given a specific stage and date within their cohort, or simply a period within which they have to stage? We deliberately haven't been prescriptive in terms of specifying the granularity of the staging process, because we're keen to get input from industry, but clearly that will be considered as part of the feedback and will be clarified subsequently within legislation. Will PPF compensation be included for scheme members already in, I presume that's already in the PPF? We are liaising with the PPF because they're not classified as a pension scheme. They're not particularly caught by the requirements to participate within the dashboard, and they're considering that they may need to liaise with the DWP in relation to potential participation. So at this stage, our working assumption is they won't be included within the dashboard. There's some further questions quite specific to particular schemes, so we'll take those offline and we will answer those in the follow-up. Where are buyout policies fitting into this? Is it all in wave 1, cohort 1? Our working assumption is buyout policies will be in that first wave, but again, that will be subject to later clarification. Will schemes have a specified contact with whom they can work to achieve? So I'm struggling that. I mean, the onboarding process is something that we will refine. We, as most of you are probably aware, we're in the process of procuring the central digital architecture provider, and within the work that we do there will be creating a fully documented onboarding process, which we'll look to share as we move through the development and the build and test phase of the dashboard program. So that's something that we will refine and communicate well ahead of the compulsion stage coming in. Okay, I think the other questions we will probably look to follow up and answer. I'll invite any other members of the board to comment on the questions that have been raised.
Morning, Paul, and everyone. It's Gary at the PDP. I think it'd be a shame not to use the DWP. We've got Joe from the DWP here helping out. And that question that you start to answer, Paul, about the implementation for smaller schemes, it'd be good to hear what the department's plans are for smaller schemes, irrespective of our recommendations, because there's a couple of questions about that. One, if I could just summarize them, one is, will dashboards apply to smaller schemes, and if so, by when? So perhaps Joe, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't at this stage have a firm view as to what will go into the regulations, which we intend to consult on at the end of this year or later this year, in terms of smaller schemes. So I think, we'd certainly welcome views from industry via the call for input on what would be a sensible timeline for targeting smaller schemes. But as I think Paul mentioned, we need to be mindful of the sort of deliverability constraints as well, and take those into account before we fix a time by which we'd expect smaller schemes to stage. I hope that helps. I know that, but we don't have a firm view as yet.
I think that does help, and implicit in that is that, Joe, that smaller schemes are within scope at the moment as well, which is sort of welcome sort of clarification. So thank you. And I think you're right, Paul. I think the other questions are mostly related to particular classes of scheme or particular schemes in itself. I was just going to pick up one question in relation to multi-employer schemes. So the question is, the multi-employer, segregated multi-employer schemes constitute one scheme or a number of schemes. For our analysis, we were looking at them as one scheme, working on the assumption that economies of scale make it so that it's advantageous to go as one scheme rather than individual segregated parts. If that's not the case, really interested to see the feedback as part of the consultation and the evidence to support that as well. And then we can sort of model and sort of look at that sort of impact. So I thought I'd just explain our working assumption and leave it to the consultation for people to push back on. Dave, I don't know if you want to add anything to that analysis, or is...
Sorry, Gary, is that David Reed or David Marchbanks?
Sorry, too many Davids. I think we're going to have to enforce a rule that only one David at a time is allowed to be fielded publicly by the PDP to avoid confusion. It was Dave Marchbanks.
Thanks for clarifying. No, I think anything to add to what you've already covered there, okay. Gary.
All right, thanks. So, Paul, those were just the other questions I think that were outstanding, and didn't want to let Joe get away scot-free this morning.
Can I just, so in terms of staging dates, and we've still got quite a bit of work to do to sort of finalise what we think the right staging dates are for the different cohorts within the waves. But it's probably worth mentioning that our sort of current view is the way to approach this would be to give schemes a date by which we'd expect them to have connected by, rather than but that's a current view. It's not a finalised view.
Well, I'm glad you said that and we're able to say that this morning, Joe, because then that allows us to provide a bit more sort of detail. So, and again, this based on our current view. What we're thinking about is if there's a date by which the scheme must have onboarded, well, it all just doesn't happen on one date. So what we're thinking about doing is putting together our guidance and standards in such a way as to help schemes navigate that process that James was referring to earlier on in such a way that they can come on board and be on board by that date. So I think the answer to the question on the current view, Joe, is by a final date, but with a window of onboarding from before that for the actual procedural points as well. And that's what we've been discussing with the department. So hopefully that answers that key question raised.
Thanks, Gary. A couple of new questions. When will the state pension be viewable from the dashboard's availability point? Dave, I think you covered this in the slides, but you just want to reiterate when we envisage state pension coming on board?
Yeah, sure. So I highlighted as we're going through the slides that the expectation is that state pension information will be available from the very first cohort. But the question is, I think, about when will it be viewable? So it will be viewable on dashboards when dashboards are launched to the public. So the question is quite right. The state pension will be viewable from the dashboard's available point. So although state pension will be expected to be available, i.e. kind of connected into the ecosystem from the very first cohort, that doesn't translate into actually being viewable on dashboards until you reach that critical mass to enable us to launch dashboards publicly.
Another question, how will you ensure a fair marketplace for public sector schemes to procure an ISP provider and not be limited to their software provider? We've done a lot of work over the first part of this year to understand how providers, including software providers, TPAs, insurers and master trusts will seek to connect into the dashboard ecosystem. The sort of universal approach is some form of integrated service provider, sort of middleware solution that will sit between the dashboard ecosystem and the host system. And we know that software providers are looking to provide some form of ISP solution for their clients. We're also seeing an emerging market for independent ISP providers, and we anticipate that that's likely to further develop and means that the clients won't be beholden to their software provider, and we anticipate a competitive market emerging. But you'll see through the call for input that we are looking to get further insight into how that market is likely to develop and the potential appetite for other organisations to come into that ISP marketplace. As Jane mentioned, one of the key steps is the creation of the industry-wide API, and that will allow software providers and independent ISP providers to begin working on their ISP solutions. So we'd anticipate that over the coming months we'll get a clearer view of how this market is likely to develop. I suggest the others are more granular in their nature, so
Paul, just before you wrap up, I thought there's a couple of questions about the interaction between sort of the couple different cohorts within the waves I was going to pass across to Dave. So if people go sort of a couple of minutes, Dave, if you wouldn't mind sort of answering the question. I think it's the overlap point that it doesn't appear that our proposals were one completely sequential, and if so, is that the case, and why is that the case?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for the question. So we've set out the cohorts. It looks like it's kind of just purely sequential, but we've got questions in the call for input to help ascertain whether that should be purely cohort 1, then cohort 2, then cohort 3, or whether there would be some overlap between them. And similarly, there was, I think, a question about the waves, whether there'd be some overlap. And I think we haven't been too prescriptive about this, because I think we want the evidence that we get back from the call for input responses to inform this. So if there are, aside from voluntarily deciding to stage early, if there's clear evidence that some providers in one particular cohort or wave could start earlier than the rest of that cohort or wave, then as well as wanting to encourage kind of early staging, which as I said is something that will be really important to help achieve that critical mass earlier, as well as encouraging early staging, there might be a rationale for having a slight kind of staggering, so overlap of the cohorts as well as waves. But I think what we've been clear is that the evidence that we've reviewed indicated that this sequencing was kind of would meet the objectives in terms of the pace and deliverability. The precise ordering of and timings obviously will be informed by the evidence that we get back. So we haven't been too prescriptive about whether there'd be some overlap or whether it would be all of cohort 1 before any in cohort 2, and etc. etc. So I hope that helps expand on that point a bit. Thanks,
Dave. And that's useful. Could just have been raised by a number of individuals asking the same related questions. So thanks. That's all, I think. Paul, back to you.
Paul, before I can pick up the one on devolved.
Sure.
Just to so the devolved government, so the legislation will apply to England, Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland will. There's a provision in the legislation for Northern Ireland to write corresponding legislation for schemes in Northern Ireland. And on the point around LGPS as well. So we have been with the regulators, we've been talking to representatives of devolved administrations and LGPS as well, and what we're aiming to do, and there seems to be consensus around this, is that, you know, for public service schemes, you take a workforce and bring them on at the same time. So LGPS would go on as one. Police across the devolved administrations would also have the same, you know, they would share the same staging date across the workforces, across the countries and local schemes.
Thanks, Joe. In terms of next steps, obviously, we're hoping and anticipating, you know, a very good response to the call for input. Obviously, we anticipate quite a lot of evidence and insight that we need to review. We'll be sharing our analysis of those responses with DWP and FCA, and obviously, you know, they will use that to inform their draft regulations, which are anticipated to come out later in the year. We'll also be looking to publish a summary of our analysis once we've undertook that, you know, review of submissions. So please, you know, we reiterate again, the value of your input is significant. So please take part, and that will give us valuable insight into the next stage of the staging model. Okay, there's a number of questions that we feel are best answered outside of this webinar, so we'll get to work on those, and we'll look to publish questions, Q&As as soon as possible. So thanks again for joining. We appreciate your time, and also appreciate the time that you'll take in providing the response to the call for input. So thank you very much. I look forward to catching up again soon.